There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel on another Friday Reads. I'm taping this Thursday morning. I'm out at the farm with Mum. The first thing I have to say is, for the first time since I've been doing these mystery guest chats, I screwed up in the blouse coordination department. I have always, I tape the mystery guest interviews usually a few days ahead, sometimes even longer ahead than that. But I always keep careful track of which blouse I use for the mystery guest chat and wear the same one when I tape the Friday Reads, but I didn't pack that blouse, which is ridiculous because I remember washing it the night before I came out yesterday and then rolling it up to put it in my suitcase, but for some reason it didn't make it into my suitcase. I just found out, so I'm not I'm not blouse coordinated, but I'm sure you will overlook it just this once. It's really cold in Saskatchewan, although it's supposed to warm up to a balmy minus 14 by the end of today. It's much colder than that now, and winter is here. And we've had a lot of snow at the farm. I basically came out here to accompany Mum, but I did plan to go over to the other house. There's a second house on the farm that I grew up in, and there's a bunch of boxes of my personal stuff in the basement there, and I wanted to retrieve my undergrad essays for two reasons. One, I remember for Victober, I think it was this year, Chris of the Book Cougars read the same, oh goodness, was it I think Wilkie Collins novel that I had remember writing an undergrad paper on and wowing my prof about my insight, and I wanted to show it to her. And also David Carpenter, who you know I've been doing a series of interviews with, and he doesn't really remember me from back in those days. And so I wanted to, there was one essay in particular that he had really praised me on, and I wanted to show it to him just to prove my identity or something. So, but what I'm trying to get at here is that the little house there's so much snow, nobody shoveled it out, and I don't want to shovel it out just to go down in the basement and get those. So that might have to wait until the spring. We'll see how it goes. Quite happy to stay indoors all day today. All right, so without further ado, another fascinating mystery guest for you. And this week's mystery guest is the British writer Joe Bedford, joining us from Lincolnshire in the UK. Welcome, Joe.
Howdy, yes, thanks so much for having me from very, very blustery Lincolnshire.
It's very, very blustery Saskatoon, so we're sister cities at the moment. Joe is the author most recently of, and I believe this is his debut novel, the fabulous title, A Bad Decade for Good People, which came out in June this year. And the other, even more recent accolade is that Joe won the Bridport Prize for his short story, Zanzibar Blue. And that announcement was just made a few weeks ago. And I was lucky to get my hands on a PDF of that story and just read it last night. It's fantastic. And you can buy the ebook, or I think also a physical book, from the Bridport Prize website of all the winners from the various genres. And I'll have a link to that information in the show notes. Why don't we start with your novel? What a fabulous title. Tell us about A Bad Decade for Good People.
Of course, yeah. Thank you. I'm glad you liked the title. I think I probably spent about 50% of the whole working time coming up with that and cobbled together the rest with the spares. No, I've been very pleased because it's just like you mentioned, it is my debut. So it feels like a special project. I've been writing for a long time, or what feels like a bloody long time. So when A Bad Decade for Good People came out, it felt like a turning point and also like a validation, of just years of beavering away at the bloody desk. If your friends read it and your family might read some of your work, and you might have some smaller prizes and some short stories, or you're kind of edging towards this, but having something concrete and big and juicy. Yeah, it feels really good, and I'm really pleased with. I worked with an editor at Parthian Books, a guy called Rob Harris, a fantastic editor. He did a great job with it, and they put a lovely jacket on it, which is kind of
French flaps.
Yes, with flaps. Yes, I've got
French
on it.
Flaps. Yes,
with flaps. I mean, probably just appealing to my vanity, but one of the things I guess I'm worried about, which I imagine other debut authors have also been worried about, is that will your publisher make it look like a big ugly brick? And there is nothing you can do about it if they do. But I was very pleased and relieved that they actually put together something which I think is really beautiful. The premise is it's about a place I feel very strongly about, which is Brighton, which is on the south coast of England. It's a very flamboyant place. It was an old Georgian holiday town. It's now the kind of gay capital of the UK, and it still has a burgeoning club scene. It also has a very strong kind of activist presence. It's one of the places in the UK that would consider very openly liberal. It's an extremely liberal environment, but also hand in hand with all of those things comes aspects of a dark underbelly, deep-seated problems which kind of get washed underneath the boldness and the bravery that is kind of associated with the city, the kind of thing that you would see on its surface. Like all places, there's a lot of complex things going on. But I lived there for many years, and I love it to bits. My story just follows. It's a young man. He's on the lookout for himself, I guess, in that classic old romantic novel sense. And he goes down to Brighton with his sister, and he becomes embroiled with this group of people who are tied to these activist circles and to these great social movements, which was sort of ballooning up in the mid 2010s. Anyone listening in from the UK will recognise that my novel begins in 2016, and for people in the UK, that year really jumps out because everybody knows what happened in 2016, which is that we had a little vote on whether we should remain part of the European Union as we had been, and by a relatively slim margin, we the people said we'll have a go on our own. It caused a huge uproar in Brighton, especially because it was a place which was so confidently and proudly attached to a European identity. And to have that kind of pulled away had an effect on people, not just as groups, not just as activists and people who get together and march and protest, but as individuals. It impacted us, every one of us, on an individual level. And whether that was wholly positive, wholly negative, whatever people took from that, everybody took something from it. Everybody was forced to shift at that time.
And the plot thickens because I think there's a sexy man, is he Spanish or something, comes into the picture.
Yes, sexy Spanish man. Again, the great romantic novelists toolkit was opened up. Yeah, the young man, the narrator of the story, when he gets down to Brighton, he finds amongst all the political upheaval that's going on and all of these crises which are emerging within these groups, especially within the activist community, he also happens to stumble across an attractive and enigmatic man who is kind of apart from that. And one of the things that Brightonians will recognise is our Spanish community. Brighton's always been famous for decades for the gay scene. But appended to that is the people who are coming to Brighton from Europe and from further afield, especially people from Spain. I mean, when I was living in Brighton, I had many Spanish friends, and a lot of them came over because the Spanish economy was collapsing, and we found ourselves in the situation in which we had engineers, scientists, dentists, doctors who were coming over, and because they couldn't get any work at all in Spain, they were coming over to Brighton with a low level of English, and so they had to enter into these service roles or cleaning roles, even though they were, mid 40s, highly qualified, highly competent, intelligent, but they found themselves in this position. So when my narrator meets one of these chaps, I think he's intrigued in the same way that I was by this community who have kind of been dislocated in a very different but perhaps analogous or at least simultaneous way to the way that liberals in the south of England were dislocated at that time.
A couple of rapid fire label queen type questions. Is this a gay novel? Is this a Brexit novel? Or do you resist either of those labels?
Oh, that's good. I like the label of label queen. I've got to say, I mean, since it's come out, it's been reviewed, and it's been reviewed really generously, which I'm grateful for. And through that kind of mirror that puts up, you get a sense, or I get a sense of how people are taking it and what labels they're attaching to it. I have read reviews and critiques which called it a queer novel, for example. And I have also read reviews which called it a Brexit novel. And other people use this term, which is even worse, which is the state of the nation novel. Is a phrase that kept cropping up. And my trepidation with those categories, I suppose, is that I think that they're very useful for selling a book. And if one's job is to market and try to make a novel digestible to a wide audience within 5 words or a couple of seconds, then those terms are extremely useful. So I never say, oh, no, it can't be that thing. But I do think that that language probably belongs with the people with the purse strings. And as a writer, I find myself, if I sat down and said, okay, I think I want to write a Brexit novel, for example, I think that would probably be extremely limiting. It would probably be counterproductive to the creative process, because at the end of the day, it's not really the writer's job to say what it is and what it isn't. I think when it's out in the world, it then belongs to the readership, and the readership can put the labels on, and they can say what it is that draws them towards it. And in that sense, the marketers can have fun.
And this is definitely a tongue-in-cheek follow-up question. To what degree is this a State of Joe Bedford novel? How autobiographical is this novel?
Yeah, that's another classic. I've had this discussion quite a few times, especially with sort of friends and family members who are curious as to whether anything in the novel actually took place. And because I was living in that city at that time, and I very strongly resemble the silly young man who is trying to, scrabble his way through the world, I think it's a fair question. I have no shame when it comes to taking things from real life and from the stories of my friends and family and the people around me and exploiting them for the drama. I really have no qualms whatsoever. I had a creative writing tutor around the time that I began my master's, and I was working on this as part of my master's. And he said his friend had written a book, and the friend had put him in it as a character. The tutor read the book, got to the end of the book, and then the man said, oh, did you like your character? The tutor said, oh, I didn't realize that I was in it. I didn't recognize myself. What was the character's name? The man said, well, George, he had your name. He had the same name. It was the same person. He didn't change the name, and he made him do things that the man had done in real life, and still he didn't recognize himself at the end. So I kind of feel like, for me, even though I know that some of these things are based on events that have happened, or more broadly on thoughts and feelings that I have had, I feel like by the time that it gets translated into the prose, not only are those events and those people other than me unrecognizable, I am unrecognizable. And I'm unrecognizable not just to my friends and family who kind of say, oh, I kind of could see that you might do something like that. They're also unrecognizable to me. And if I was unable to get to the point in which the protagonist and the decisions they were making did feel kind of unrecognizable, I think then I would not be serving the drama in the way that I quite enjoy, which is to say that everything that these characters do just has to be interesting to the reader, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with how I think and feel. Now, the flip side to that is I think that it's impossible to do that without telling the truth. And if, as a writer, you sit down and you say, I'm going to invent a fantasy land that's populated with dragons and wizards and orcs, you still have a responsibility to tell the truth. And in that sense, something recognizable might shine through, but it's more likely to shine through by accident in the facets of the drama which are incidental and subconscious than they are to shine through the fact that this young man is my age and lives in this city at this time, and all the other things which are essentially base categories for these characters. I think the truth, the thing that is impossible to obscure, comes through in ways that you never expect.
There's that fabulous fictional alchemy that occurs.
Yes, that's right.
I think I understand why the title is A Bad Decade for Good People, especially hearing that you spent a lot of time and energy coming up with it. Tell us more about the title.
Sure, yes. One of the things that when I was writing, it started to become clear that it would fit into this state of the nation milieu, whether I would like that to be the case or not. I think one of the decisions I made early on was that what I would like to be able to discuss, or at least what I enjoy in other novels, is when you get a sense of a time and a place and of broader changes and a broader drama, but it's delivered through individuals and it's delivered through personal stories. And for me, to write a book, let's say I wrote a book and it was called A Bad Decade, which would also apply because the 2010s for a lot of us did feel bad. I think that has artistic validity, and lots of very good or at least very successful authors have written books which are like this, and they are about a time and place. But I feel as though without the individual characters that act as sort of processors for us and interpreters and conduits through which the events of the decade are revealed, I don't feel that satisfaction. I don't feel like I've had a full meal. It's not a well-rounded drama, because what I want is to see how these big events like the referendum, something like this, how these big events impact on individuals in unexpected ways. That was part of finding my way through to the title and to the broad concept. But the other side of it was the nature of the people, which changed a lot during the writing process. And it took some honest feedback from some friends to start to hone in on what this book told me about how I felt about other people. And the first draft I remember was very cynical, and the characters were transparently vapid, and there was lots of virtue signaling, as they call it, and all of this stuff. Essentially, the narrator was quite critical of all the people around him, which is the easiest way to reveal yourself as a hypocrite, because the characters I was setting up for criticism were doing the things that I do and were doing the things that I dislike about myself. That undermined the drama. And I think there are satirists who do that extremely well, but I'm just not one of them. And so I got closer to this idea that actually all of these characters, including the very, very vapid ones, including the very performative ones, actually at heart, they're all essentially reaching for the same thing. Now, one of the things that they're reaching for is a sense of belonging. And I think in a novel that is about a time and a place, and that sets you up to read about a bad decade, it became crucial to underline the fact that everybody who was involved in that decade were both actors within the drama and people who contributed to the nature of the decade, the events that were happening. And they were also, I could say that they were victims of the bad things that happened, but they were recipients of the effects of the decade. And the thing that I realized once the cynicism had been kind of undermined by my friends who didn't do it very gently, what I was left with was this renewed faith in people. People do say crazy things on Twitter. They make decisions which I do not understand. Some of them, including people I know, harbor real bitterness or real angst or whatever else is going on inside. But I do essentially think that they are attempting, even when they really mess up, most people are attempting to achieve something good or to better something, either for themselves or for the people that they love. It would be extremely dangerous if we lost that lesson because of the tumult that we're experiencing at the moment. And it's the same in North America as it is in Europe. It's very, very easy to look at the news or to go onto social media to see the choices that people are making, choices that I find radically bizarre, and to say that they are doing that because they are bad people, which I don't believe.
Well, one more somewhat flippant question before we move on to hear about your short story. Will there be a sequel? Working title, A Good Decade for Bad People.
Yeah, I've got a feeling that the 2020s might be well served by that title in the end, unfortunately. It seems to be very lucrative at the moment, anyway, for the baddies. But no, I feel like this novel gave me the chance to process, to deal with hang-ups that I had about the last 10 years. I worked through those, in a therapeutic sense, in a straight out therapeutic sense. I think I worked through those, and I think I eventually found the story that I wanted to tell, although it did take a little while. And I think that story has been told. And we're now in 2024. It's about to be 2025. Next year in 2025 is going to be crazy. I think no matter what goes on, it's going to be crazy from the starting gate. So I think there are new stories to be told now.
Well, speaking of stories, tell us about Zanzibar Blue. I read it last
Well, I'm
night.
really
I
grateful for
loved it.
you.
It's very much set in a different part of the world with a bunch of other stuff going on that seems like a big change from your novel, but set it up for us.
Thank you. I'm so grateful that you read it. It's really sweet of you. Yeah, I was super pleased. It's a short story. It's 5,000 words. I was over the moon. It won the Bridport Prize, which is a very prestigious short story award here in the UK. It's open internationally. Anybody can enter. I really encourage people to enter, including if people are listening in North America and elsewhere. Zanzibar Blue was the story of a European person who goes to Zanzibar, which is an island just off East Africa. It's part of Tanzania. And she goes there. I envision it as a woman, but other people have read it as a man. And
Well,
I
it's a
think
little
this.
bit ambiguous. That's one of the tantalizing things about the story. Yes.
I'm glad. When you were reading, did you picture a man or a woman in?
I did until I saw there was one sentence. I thought, oh, I think this might actually be a woman.
Oh, interesting. Yes, there is one. There is one
Yeah.
sentence which I think has a little bit of a signpost on it.
There's an
And
adjective.
a
You
lot of
use
my
the
friends read it as
adjective
a man.
male, a male
About
friend.
yes,
And I thought, oh, I don't think a man would, you're filtering it through the consciousness of
you're
this character. And I don't think that the reference would be male friends if it was.
yeah, very well read. That's exactly the intended effect. I pictured it as a woman in mind, but it would be useful if people were left able to imagine a man. I'm always kind of thinking about whether I am able to inflect a gendered reading, or whether it's worth inflecting a gendered reading onto my own work, and what possibilities that affords us as writers. And I have no idea, and I'm not even close to making my mind up as to how to do that or whether to bother. But I did find it interesting in this exercise. Essentially, he or she goes to Zanzibar, to this island, stays for 6 weeks or so, I think. And during the course of that time, they stay at this guest house run by a South African man. And the South African man seems to be unpopular in the village, seems to have a little bit of a murky past, and perhaps some questionable, even shady behavior going on under the surface. And while this guest is there interacting with the Tanzanians in the village and keeping half an eye on the owner of this guest house, a mood kind of starts to pervade the island, which people have been able to recognize. It's a tropical paradise, but there is a mood of almost dread that
Mhm.
is under the surface.
And the complicated stuff around colonialism. The protagonist is writing is it a work of history, a chapter about British colonial era, I think in Tanzania, but I can't remember that detail. So there's all these things with colonial and post-colonial stuff going on that adds to that atmosphere. Just fascinating. Oh my God. Well done, sir.
That's extremely kind. It's a very complex place, not just now, but because of the history of colonialism, which
Absolutely.
affected the east coast of Africa so strongly. Obviously, the rest of the continent too. But the east of Africa, there was a culture of colonization there, which was slightly different in character to South Africa, for example, or West Africa with the transatlantic slave trade. And you see aspects of the colonial history in Zanzibar. And one of the things that I found interesting while I went for 3 months at the beginning of 2024, what I found interesting was that there is a parallel. The parallel isn't it isn't perfectly analogous, but there is another. There new people are arriving, and the colonists who ran Zanzibar for hundreds and hundreds of years, both British and Portuguese in the 19th and 18th century, and before that, the Arab slavers who came from Oman. Funnily enough, Zanzibar was the capital of Oman. It was such a pivotal part of that legacy of colonialism. Those people who were coming and going and building the culture of East Africa as it was then, when Swahili culture was brand new and it was just starting to emerge. There's a funny parallel, or at least a parallel is invited between what's happening now, which is in the last 20 years, an island which is essentially, probably 30 years, an island which is essentially a fishing island in which there's almost nothing in the middle, and the outskirt is surrounded by tiny, tiny fishing villages with one town, Stone Town, the capital, they literally say, do you want to go to town? Which is the one town on the island to go to the capital. It's like the old-fashioned Victorians would say, let's go to town and go to London. The tourist trade, which is relatively, I mean, certainly in terms of the history of the island, brand new, is completely transforming that environment extremely rapidly. And in that sense, although I don't think it's not a simple parallel in which, tourism is the new colonialism. I don't believe that. It's not a particularly useful analogy, but it is a generative, dramatic exercise to see, oh, you know what? The last group of British people who came here, European people who came here, radically altered this environment, and their legacy is seen absolutely everywhere, especially in Stone Town. Now we are 150 years later, and a brand new group of people who are coming, which is like very rich Russian couples and European women who are looking for a local man to have a holiday fling with, which is one of the topics which Zanzibar Blue covers in a little more detail. And I found just a fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating while I was there to get a glimpse into how those complex interactions work between people who have been fishing families for generations and who still live in very, very small houses with no windows or doors, and people who are coming and building grand hotels and resorts on the doorstep of these fishing villages, and how that that interaction is affecting both cultures. And again, when we bore down into the individual and see how it affects people who come to visit or who come to start businesses or who have lived there and their ancestors lived there, then I think we get the real meat of the drama, where you can see that there is some potentially very volatile change occurring in this environment, but we're only given the very, very surface evidence, and then it's up to the reader to try and work out what is going wrong in this place.
Absolutely. Well, it's a fascinating story. And now that you've told me all this, given me new perspectives, I think I have to reread it immediately. So on your website, which of course will be linked in the show notes, there is a section of interviews that you have done with other writers, many of them known to me, about research. Tell us about that project.
Thank you. Yes, it's an Arts Council funded project, which I'm very grateful to be supported by. And essentially, it's involved me interviewing novelists and short story writers and flash fiction writers about the craft process, and particularly how they go about performing research, which will then feed into their drama. So for some of these novelists, let's say they're writing historical fiction, I think that process is relatively intuitive and familiar to us. They go into archives, they unfold these historical mysteries, and parts of that detail just become imbued, and they color the story and they bring verisimilitude to the drama. I feel like for historical writers, that's quite a relatively transparent process, but although they do have fascinating insights. What if you're writing a short story collection which is about modern life or about marriage or about motherhood or family? How do research processes work in that respect? So I've been extremely lucky to talk to, I don't know, writers that I really admire, and also a lot of writers from independent publishers, especially in the UK, who are kind of pushing the envelope, creating stories which we're less familiar with, that we've heard less, voices that we've come into contact with a little less in the literary world. And in that respect, research has been a really useful entry point for me in terms of getting an insight into how they work and where the stories are coming from, what's generating that material. Something like if someone were to read Zanzibar Blue, I think that's it's the kind of story which, like many of the authors that I've been talking to, they're bringing narratives to us which are about the crossing of cultures. And that always comes from some place. And one of the most interesting things about the interview series is just been trying to pin down where did these things come from, both in the real world and also in their personal experience and their mental outlook.
Well, the list of writers is incredible. The one that jumps out at me most is Douglas Bruton, who I have interviewed a couple times on my channel. So I'm looking forward to reading that one. Is this going to end up being a book someday?
I'm not sure. It depends on the money, man, I think, as it always does. I've been thinking a little bit about what would be most useful to do with this kind of, because I've interviewed over 50 now, and they're still continuing. Eventually, there'll be 100 or however many. And I kind of think, who is this resource for? Well, what is the use of this thing? For me, other than hearing authors that readers would like to hear from, and they would like to see, oh, I wonder how they put this together. Where did they get the idea from this? Which is something that could book bloggers achieve, for example. I think that this as a resource, it's for writers, really. I feel like sharing this, especially with people who are early on in their writing journey and who want to see how they can translate things that have happened in their life or things that they have read about, or a combination of the two and everything else into drama. I think this is the kind of resource which I would have really enjoyed as a younger writer. And I still get loads from it myself. I mean, half of it is just me get I now have personal access to crazy tips from writers that I love, which is brilliant for me. But obviously, it's a pleasure to share it, and it's the kind of thing that I would like to motivate writers, especially early career writers.
So, everybody, as I said, Joe's website is linked in the show notes, and then there's a separate tab, Writers on Research. You check it out. What are you working on now, Joe?
I could tell you, but I'll have to kill you. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm very lucky. I've had a scholarship to do a PhD in which I've been writing fiction, which is the most amazing. I'm coming to the end now, but it's been an incredible 3 years. Being able to write for a job is nuts. So I've been working on this particular project for that. It'll be done soon. It's about the UK. It's about our countryside. And one of the things that is actually probably more prevalent in North America, but that we have also in our rural culture, this nexus between attitudes towards nature and our feelings about the countryside and our feelings about our country, and specifically who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that nexus is something that culturally has been tied together right to the founding of certainly the United States of America, but also our concept of England as we've inherited it from the Victorians and the Georgians, which is that if the countryside stands as a symbol for the country as a whole, and our rural culture in the UK is much more exclusive, culturally exclusive and homogenous than urban culture, in which you would find, for example, in London, you will find generations of people who have come from the West Indies and from India and from Africa and from Europe. Then what does that say about our conception of our country and about ourselves as a people?
Well, it sounds amazing. So, I think you have maybe a couple books to recommend to us.
Yes, I mean, problem with recommending books is that there's a big list in my head with about 10,000 books on it, which I get going. What I would say is that if people are interested in finding particularly British, but also international authors who do not have the raging, all-consuming machine that is book publicity and the big five publishers behind them, which means you get to see a big poster in a train station with their name on it. If you're looking for authors who are pushing the envelope and are working in those more marginal spaces, then among the 50 writers that I've interviewed on the Writers on Research series, you will find some incredible independent authors, especially British. I do champion that as a resource just for finding those names. But if we're going classic, I've been reading a lot about the countryside. So I've got a shelf next to me with maybe 10 D.H. Lawrences and 10 Thomas Hardys, and I'm rereading Howard's End because I think, when in doubt, I go to Forster. It's all a bit of a sort of greeny blue haze, and the characters are kind of like little dolls operating in a doll's house, but I love it. I love it to pieces. So I'm always going back to the English classics, and especially the Edwardians.
Only connect.
Only connect. Exactly.
Only connect.
Right. Exactly right. Yes.
It's time for me to reread Howard's Ends. Absolutely. Joe, I could talk to you all day, but I think we've now talked for about half a day. So I hope you'll come back.
Oh, I would love to come back. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm so pleased with your questions as well. I mean, like every author, I love banging on about myself. So you've really given me a go.
It's been an absolute delight. I'm looking forward to reading A Bad Decade for Good People. And I should tell my viewers, I've just checked, and it's available on booksellers, online bookstores, the famous ones that we're not supposed to mention in polite company. You can find it pretty easily, including Blackwell's. Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sean. That's really kind.
My goodness, I could listen to that man, Joe Bedford, talk all day. This week, I have managed to get one video edited and posted. That was a really fun Zoom chat about bailing with Chris of the Book Cougars, James of Caustic Cover Critic, and Dorian of Bookish Twitter fame. And I made so many mistakes in doing the introduction to that video that on Dorian's command, I have included a blooper reel at the beginning of the video. So even if you don't want to watch the whole video, it is a really fun chat about bailing, DNFing, from 4 different perspectives. But the blooper reel is fun, so you can check that out. And that's all I managed to get finished in terms of editing. And if you join my Patreon in the next, 48 hours or something, you can take part in this month's Bookish Brunch. More details on joining Patreon are in the show notes, and I will always welcome more support of what I do here. I have started 2 new books, and I will check in on those, and I'm not planning to start anything new. Goodness, I don't. Probably for the rest of the year? Not very much anyway. Maybe an audiobook or something. Very little else. So, I have now read half of the Australian novel Hospital by Sanya Rushdi, I believe it's pronounced, and it was written in Bengali and translated by Arunava Sinha. And maybe enjoy is not the right word, although I think I would use that verb, enjoy. I love the way it's written. The protagonist is a young woman. She's maybe 30 or 34, I believe. And she had been institutionalized for a psychotic episode a few years before. And now she's having those symptoms are coming back. And so she lives with her extended family in Australia. I think it might be Sydney. She's a brilliant academic, but she had to withdraw from her PhD program in psychology, I believe, when she'd had the serious breakdown years before. And now she's having symptoms that are worrying her family. It's completely a first-person perspective from her. It's autobiographical, but it's not a memoir, it's a novel. And I just love the way it's written, because it's written in a very calm tone from her perspective. And she very calmly narrates all of her experience from her own point of view. And she's, the world's most unreliable narrator. So you have to puzzle over how much of what she's telling you corresponds to reality, especially what her family and then hospital staff are saying to her. And a lot of her reactions are paranoid. And she's a very loving person, trying to make her way in the world. And I absolutely adore the protagonist. Yes, she's having severe mental health issues to deal with, and she's probably not dealing with them very well, but I just love her. So far, I've been deeply wowed by the compassionate way in which her voice is put on the page. I'm just finding it absolutely stunning, and this is a buddy read, my last buddy read of the year with Joe Smith, and I have the Australian edition with the fabulous cover. This is a illustration created by the author. The other one that I've started that I'm reading to Mary Jean, so I'm a ways into, maybe 15 or 20%, is Christ on a Bike by Orla Owen. And we are really enjoying this. It is a bit of a dark tale, and the degree to which the narrative is focused on the protagonist, I love this main character. Her name is Karis. She's also I might be conflating the ages of these 2 characters. Maybe only one of them is in their 30s, and I think it might be Karis. I think the unnamed narrator of this one may be younger, a little bit younger than that. But anyway, Karis, she gets an unexpected inheritance that is going to set her up for life, never have to work again, and live in a rich mansion in Wales. She has to move from London to Wales in order to inherit this estate, and the rest of her life she will be looked after financially and otherwise. I'm being mysterious because there isn't much more. I've already told you more than what's on the back cover, but Orla Owen was my mystery guest a few months ago, and she said more. So basically, the man who died is a stranger to her, but because she wandered in by accident to a church where his body was not lying in state, but, but just like an hour before the funeral. He had no family or friends living, and he left his very sizable estate to whoever signed the guest book at the funeral, and she was the only one that didn't. She didn't attend the funeral. She just signed the book because she'd walked in not knowing that there was a funeral happening shortly thereafter, and that's why she got the estate. So it's a really crazy, in a way, a crazy premise, but through that premise, Mary Jean and I'm reading it to Mary Jean, we're really beguiled by how lovely this protagonist, Karis, is. To use the cliche, it couldn't have happened to a nicer person, but her sister is horrible. And I found myself temporarily souring on the novel because there was a whole chapter that was all about how jealous and spiteful her sister was of this unexpected good luck. And being in her head for a full chapter, I thought, oh my God, I hope there's not too much more of her in this novel because I couldn't stand her. And that's funny. I'm not typically somebody who doesn't like a book because I don't like one of the characters, but it occasionally happens. This is reminding me of the huge, was it Death Stars, something. It's a Joyce Carol Oates 600-page novel that I read a few years ago. And I enjoyed the story, except it was one of the protagonist's daughters that was like that. She was just the most horrible person alive. And I had to spend a lot of time inside her head, and it was very unpleasant. I don't want those people in my life, and I don't really want to deal with them too much in my fiction. So we're back to focusing more on Karis. She has just moved to Wales and is just overwhelmed with all the amenities of her new house and her new car and blah, blah, blah. But it's not going to be a happy story. It's probably going to end up being a powerful indictment of capitalism, and as someone who has lived a very privileged life in so many ways, probably good for me to read. But I'm enjoying it. I'm expecting more and more darkness, but hopefully not too much more of that awful sister, Saren. All right, well, that's what I've got for this Friday Reads. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week. I'll be back in the city.